it's a social system characterized by entities having numerous relations with other entities in the system. Hierarchies define how many relations you can have in a very specific way. Polyarchies break that up. You can have hierarchies in a polyarchy. You can have different types of relation, equitable and vertical, inside a polyarchy. Why is this important for this conversation? We have Muslims coming to Europe now. We have Africans from societies that are not individualistic coming to Europe. And one untold story about how to relate with humans coming from societies that are polyarchical, and that's what I'm implying here, is that people in non-polyarchical societies, more vertical organized societies, don't really have the wherewithal to understand some of the cultural, the German word would be Selbstverständlichkeit. Is there a Norwegian equivalent for that? Yeah. So how I see myself, how I have experienced life so far. The point about this model, and I'll finish it, is when you come from a polyarchical society, something happens to you if you grow up in a polyarchical society. We were talking yesterday about the kind of networks, neuronal networks, that humans develop between 0 and 3. If you grow up and you have, let us say, 4 mothers, 1 father, 4 mothers, because you're growing up in a polygamous society. I had this case. I was helping a migrant who had arrived from Gambia find his way in Germany. And he got himself into trouble because he found himself courting several women, which he thought and found was a natural thing. But the kind of stress that he was getting from the individual women when they found out about that was very stressful to him. Very, very stressful to him. And it was very stressful to the women.
Jeg tror det var en liten misforståelse. Hvis noen sa at han snakket om selvstendighet, så var det ikke det. Self-verständlichkeit means obviously.
Obviousness, yes.
Selvfølgelighet.
Nei, selvforståelse betyr det. Selvforståelse, hvordan du ser på deg selv. Selvforståelse. Ikke den meningen.
Am I causing trouble now?
It is obvious.
Yes.
It's a natural way that you look at yourself. Natural way within different contexts.
May I be a bit Jundal precision industry? It's a cultural way.
Yeah, cultural way, of course.
Yes, because natural way in the way we work is
natural
biological.
way in different contexts. For the one with 10 wives, that's natural. For me, with 1 male and some others, European way of behaving, it's not for me, but that's the European way of in a European context.
Exactly. And the point about this is, you see, now we're moving between structural patterns of interaction that impact on cultural assumptions of right, wrong, good, bad, acceptable, unacceptable. And it's important to see that humans have ways of organizing themselves that are very different. And my contention here is that the untold story in how Europeans and Africans relate is that individualistic societies have a tendency not to understand or not to see when they're dealing with an individual such as myself from a polyarchical society. And I'll give an example of myself, but I'll specify, not to see the implications, the depth of implications that come with this kind of biographical background. And I gave an example from my friend who really had this problem, and it took about 2 years to solve this, because you have to separate from everybody, and you have to reconcile with those that accept to be reconciled with. And it was a huge catastrophe, but we solved it. But that was just one example of, let us say, polyarchy in the family structure, because he actually had several mothers and I think 36 brothers and sisters. And so for him, it was not morally reprehensible. It was just lost in communication, lost in translation. Another implication of that I want to bring up is emotional intelligence, the EQ, the so-called. I have a tragic example that I want to share. A close acquaintance of mine, who's no longer, was fooled on the internet because he was looking for a partner on the internet. And someone in Nigeria responded positively to the query of closeness. Long story short, over a period of half a year, the communication led to my acquaintance losing something close to €500,000, sending it over. This was so intense that I started thinking about the mechanisms in play here. How is this possible? Of course, there are psychological dynamics within the person himself, loneliness, a strong consequence of individualistic societies, divorced, a strong consequence and frequent occurrence in Western individualistic societies. Children are gone, don't call unless you're sick or you need something, and things of that kind. So he's alone with the computer, and he starts interacting. Now, what kind of communication is capable of moving you to move your hard-earned currency into an account in the so-called dark continent? Love, the promise of love, the promise of closeness, the promise of proximity. Do you have an idea how relation literate that other person in front of a computer must be? How psychologically competent that person must be to get that bank account money from you where you are? So, in German call it die Klaviatur der Emotionen. When you grow up in a polyarchical society, by the time you're 15, with all the relations that you have permanently, it's not just one mother, one father, maybe a sister, or, 0.4. It's you and your 4 sibling in Western Europe, or 2, depending on where you are. And if you're not lucky, it's 0.9, so you're just 0.9 or something like that. Here you're dealing with human beings who have had relations to cousins, brothers and sisters, and have so-called extended families, all living in the same compound. The literacy in human emotions, the depth of literacy in human emotions that distinguishes us from Europeans is unbelievable. You said you felt joyfulness, you felt proximity, you felt friendliness, you felt welcome. We don't see that difference when we're at home. We're just being ourselves. And you feel it because there's a richness of, we approach easily, we touch easily. We take things for granted that you have regulated much in your very distinguishing, separating, differentializing societies. Now, there are implications of all of this. The hierarchy can be oppressive, repressive. The polyarchy can be what Johan has written about, can be, how do you call it, tiring. It can be, I want to say extinguishing, but that's not the word I'm looking for. It's when you overextend, you're exhausted, thank you, overexhausted. It can be exhausting. And this is one criticism that the West has towards the liberal West, by the way, the socialists, the leftists, those that like Africa, and etc. They are now publishing papers in development aid documents. You have to become more individualistic because you can't save money. If you have understood the spirit of enterprise, you dear Africans, you have to develop, of course, then you have to understand that you can't be sharing all your money all the time with all your extended family. So please become more individualistic. Start saving more money if you want to reach the levels of standard of living that we have. So it is the West cloning itself, the Dieter Zengha's model that I shared with you yesterday. If you want to live like us, have the same life expectancy as us, more differentialism in your societies, less polyarchy. And it is true. If you are unlucky and you're the only one making a living, a fortune, in a larger family, you might have to be sharing all the time, upwards, downwards, sideways. Oh, your aunt is sick, you have some, give some. Your aunt's son's daughter, cousin, da 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 da. So the accumulation in the bank account doesn't happen. So polyarchy can be exhausting, financially, materially, spiritually. Then, I have to take a short step back and complete this for you. Hierarchy, polyarchy, equiarchy, anarchy. Good. Just to complete it, why am I showing this? There's an underlying assumption that I shouldn't generalize too much, is that I am assuming that on the African continent, most societies are more polyarchical, which is more complex. They have all the other archetypes of social organization within them, is the assumption that I'm sharing. Johan says that there's a model that is anarchical, and he defines anarchy as a pattern of interaction where the actors have very little relations to each other. None, actually, to be exact, to be precise. Anarchy is no relation to each other. So eremiten, for example. Is that the word? Yeah. So that's important as a model of how humans, elements here, goal-pursuing, value-driven entities relate to each other. Not at all. This has advantages and also disadvantages. Hierarchies have advantages and disadvantages. Polyarchies have advantages and disadvantages. And then there is the equiarchy, which can perhaps be demonstrated like so, where the social pattern of interaction, the structure, is organized in such a way that everyone is at equidistance from the goals and the means to fulfill those goals by design of that pattern of interaction, by decision, by agreement. People think of communism when they see this, and modes of organization of that kind. Why is this important? Because Johan's contention is that if these four archetypes are the ways human beings and organisms as per se, but the way human beings organize interaction, then it might be important for us to know, to read when we are faced with an element that has its biographical experience in a polyarchy, or biographical experience in a hierarchy, or biographical experience in a very loose system of barely any relations, or in a way, almost rigid pattern of interaction, that we can see it, that we can read it, that we can factor that in how we deal with that entity that we're dealing with. The untold story that I'm trying to share is the assumption, very general, so general that it is mistaken in the margins, that it's wrong and not applicable in the margins, in specific individual biographies, is that when dealing with Africans, perhaps contemplate the plausibility that you're dealing with a human being who has a much broader EQ based on the what is called traditional nature of the patterns of interaction that they may come from. This is a Galtungian way of talking about cultural differences. And I haven't even gone into the cultural details. This is just from the kinds of relations that you experience biographically and how they impact your life when you enter other societies. So, yeah, this is a story that one needs to have at the back of our minds when dealing with Africa. Stop. Now, what I have is hopefully given you enough ideas to trigger some memories of your own, to talk about your experiences with Africa. If you want to share something triggered by any of what I've said, I would say that it's open, and I would try to tie in the other stories that I have with this. Tie it in. If no one has anything to share, of course, I won't force issues. Yeah, please.
Perhaps one story from a meeting in Rwanda.
Yeah.
I was heading a program in UNESCO called Women and Cultural Peace in Africa. On a project, I was heading a project in UNESCO called Women and Cultural Peace, and we had a special project in Africa, meeting lots of strong, intelligent, creative women, but without the means to cooperate with each other, which we tried to do. But we were in a meeting in Rwanda, and Burundi's women came very upset with the resolution saying that the restriction on import to Burundi that was forced upon them by Tanzania was very detrimental to people, and that if they wanted arms to go across, not to go across the borders, they didn't succeed, but where they succeeded was not to have medicine, not to have tools and things that were needed in Burundi. So they came with a resolution to the African women gathered in this meeting: please stop the embargo on Burundi. In the meeting was both politicians, academics, and peace activists. And the politicians on higher level from Tanzania had been party to Tanzania's embargo. So they came in a squeeze between their sisterly relation to the Burundi's women and their resolution and their own government.
Yes.
And we came to a total standstill on this. And it was a huge dilemma, and we didn't know how to get out of it. Until all of a sudden, one of the African women present stood up. She took the hand of the woman beside her, both sides, and started to sing one of the famous African songs, which made everybody tune in and sing. And all of a sudden we had restored the sisterly relationship to each other without solving the problem, but we could then, on a new basis, manage to discuss what do we do with this difficult situation.
It's fascinating. So the question, was this a cultural thing, or was it a interaction thing?
Well, it was cultural in the sense that it was a song that everybody loved, and they felt the relationship to Africa being stronger, and the relationship to each other stronger than a political issue that divided them.
Exactly.
So that gave them a new basis to go on with discussion as to how to solve the political issue that they were confronted with.
I'm very grateful for this story because it harkens back to one of the stories that I collected, namely to put a very complicated story very shortly. I believe that much the same way as what you've just shared, that I should share with you that an untold story of Africa's future development is that the future of Africa lies not so much in the politicians and the work they do, but in the societies and in the way that within society musicians, artists, creators, handicraftsmen and women, merchants can relate to each other. Because the political decision-making systems haven't brought about the changes they were installed for. But I can see, whenever I'm on the ground, that there is an enormous untapped potential within society as such, in such, let us say, grassroots level communication and project building. And this is one story that one really has to keep at the back of the mind. Unfortunately, there is reason to believe that the governments won't be as successful in achieving political progress as the people on the ground themselves. The question is, how can one support that? And an untold story to the public is that the development aid system of the West, the donor countries, so to say, or the global north, have been developing since the middle of the 90s towards more government-to-government cooperation, more macro-level cooperation, and less, as it used to be, giving the tax money that is collected and earmarked for development aid to projects on the ground. So the money gets siphoned off very often and doesn't reach the people. It gets siphoned off by politicians with the right connections, sitting in the right places, having the mechanisms for, the proper mechanisms and literacy for fundraising already in place. So I'm very grateful that you mentioned this, and I'm forcing a little bit this point that I wanted to share into your story, namely that it's the people that can cooperate also across the borders. And of course, African borders is something that one can also talk about. Anyone else wants to share? Yes, please.
I don't have a personal experience, but I wonder if someone has something to say about the very rapid changes between Ethiopia and Eritrea, where the new government in Ethiopia suddenly and very quickly are doing a lot of reforms, and like countries who were fighting for many years suddenly are happy together. And so I don't understand what's happening, and maybe a lot of people in the countries don't know either. So, but I don't know if someone has studied that changes.
Thank you. I have to tell you that I'm also just watching the news as it unfolds. And we actually have a conversation scheduled with a colleague from that region to explain a little more what's behind this success story. And I don't know enough to talk about that. But it is interesting to observe, and in a way it is also not all too surprising. In a way it is also not all too surprising. I can name some of the issues of contention, namely access to the sea. You see, when you cut off a country from the sea, when you have a conflict, I can say general things that may help, general things. Johan mentioned today goal pursuit. He mentioned how to attain the goal. I mentioned that an entity that is value-driven and goal-pursuing is striving to fulfill their basic needs. So if I now were to take time and to look at that, I can share with you how I would proceed. I would look into Ethiopia and Eritrea. The first thing I would do is, what are the goals in real life that you are trying to obtain? And I remember from my earlier studies of Ethiopian and Eritrean conflict that a big issue of contention was access to the sea by Ethiopia after Eritrea declared independence. And they had this issue of contention of an autobahn, of a little stretch of land that they could use to get access to the sea for trade and importation and things of that kind. So I would assume that as long as that wasn't on the table, that goal pursuit of Ethiopia wasn't being accepted and tolerated and negotiated on, in terms acceptable to Ethiopia, that was a block of potential de-escalation. So I would strongly look into that.
The little I understood from this, what's happening in Ethiopia, which is very interesting, is that there was an election in May, and then the one who won the election belongs to the tribe which is the majority. Previously it was a minority of only 4% who controlled Ethiopia and took it over. So that is a big change. The second change is, and it's interesting for this audience, is that I understand the new president has a PhD in peacemaking.
It's very true, and it's been an issue in our community, how reliable or how trustworthy the results are, and what is behind, what kind of deal makings are going on. And you did catch me there. I have refrained so far of speaking of ethnicity on the continent. It is a huge factor, because methodologically we choose to speak of nations rather than ethnic groups. And we find it's a very distorting factor in understanding political decision-making processes very often, but not always. And you are right in pointing that out.
So finally on that, when I discussed this with someone who knew a lot about it, I said I hope the new one also will include the Somali people down in the south of Ethiopia, because they have suffered terribly for decades.
Something to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
Something to keep an eye on, definitely. Just a second, please. How much more time do we have?
12:26.
I think we have at least 20 minutes.
Good.
Oh, you know, I've been listening as myself, I'm African. And this whole chaos system, I've been thinking about myself. For example, you give an example here, all these aids that they gave us, and all disappear, and goes to be where it's supposed to be. And a lot of things I see happening in Africa would not happen here. And I come to the conclusion to myself, I said, you know, the whole system, the political system is not African. The whole political system in Africa is not African. Because if we are dealing with something that we don't know, it's not ours. I'm thinking, sometimes I think, should we try to sit and mix these two things? Our own and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Because what they get on those politicians, what they get away with, they would not get away with that in Europe. And we are using the European system. So I said, this is not working. These are Western system, we don't know how to use it.
Can I ask you something?
I'm asking you, do you follow? I'm asking you, do you know any solution to this? Because that's what my belief is. We are using Western system, but we don't know how to use it because it's always messy and nothing, as she said. I can hear it, and I know I'm from Gambia. I'm from Africa. This is always happening. If it happened in Europe, it will not happen. It will not happen. A prime minister will not be sitting here doing all kinds of things, and nothing will happen. In Africa, you can. You know. So, if you can help me with that.
Oh, it's a big one, but it's definitely another one of these untold stories, namely the organic nature of the mode of governance that a people gives themselves. This Dieter Senghas that I mentioned yesterday, in his model that I had to study in 2002, was proposing a civilizational hexagon with the corners of it. Affect control, rule of law, democracy, And there was one of them which was Rechenschaftspflicht der Regierung gegenüber der Bevölkerung. So,
accountability of the government towards the population.
exactly. In short, one of the tenements of democracy. One of the tenements of democracy is responsiveness, and a two-way responsiveness. So when there is a demand for certain services and goods from the political, from the population towards the elite has to respond, or in democratic systems you are voted out and they vote someone in who delivers. Now what you're saying is very deep, because it takes us back in history a little bit. And I mentioned 1963. I said that's an important date. Actually, it's a period, I would say, I'm from Ghana, so I would be biased and I would say it's from 57 to 63 that's important. Why do I say that? Because Ghana became independent in 1957 from British colonial rule. It was the first West African country to become independent. Between 57 and 63, I think the number is 18 more countries, also Francophone countries, became independent. And the Organization of African Unity was created in 64. Okay, now I'll share a personal story with you. My mother was a fighter, an activist for independence in Ghana. Nothing goes over that period of her life where she successfully contributed, protested against her being born as a subject of the British Crown, as a property of the British. Nothing goes over that. So that victory was important, and it was a victory fought and won by Kwame Nkrumah, who was voted in 2000, I think, Africa's Man of the Century by a vote, continental vote. So that man's work was twofold. He liberated Ghana from the British Empire. Secondly, he said, we are not free until all of Africa is free from the Portuguese, from the French colonial systems. All of Africa. Here's my contention with my mother. I looked at that and I said to my mother one day exactly what you just said to me. I said, Mom, that's a bit of a cheap compromise. You know, your generation was too quickly, too happy, too satisfied with self-rule, because you kept the state system and you kept the governance mode that they left here. And here's the untold story, or very rarely heard story, about that. Namely, the governance systems that the British left in Gambia and in Ghana, for instance, were not democracies. You had a governor who was in charge of everything, he wasn't voted for, and he was not accountable. He had no Rechenschaftspflicht towards the population. When Nkrumah and the liberators of his generation, there are several, Nkrumah, Nyerere, such heroes, Lumumba, all these names, when they slipped into power, they took over the very oppressive, authoritarian political dispensations that the colonial masters had constructed. Now, when you take over such a system, you have the responsibility to either democratize it, make it more responsive to the needs of the people, or you just run with the somewhat authoritarian but very functional system that you got. And the prime objective that they had was to create the nation state, to keep the entities they had inherited together. The prime objective was not to create materially, the German word is anspruchsvoll, materially sophisticated democracies, but to keep the functional state together and to keep the population inside in check. So there's dualism is reducing it too much, but there is a simultaneity of, I want to say, joy of liberation from colonialism, self-rule and autonomy sort of joy in that, and at the same time a maintenance of incomplete systems of democratic governance. And we still have carryovers from that to this day. It's not that simple as I've said it, because Nkrumah particularly, he said, as I've mentioned, Ghana is not free as long as the rest of Africa is not free from colonial rule. After '63, he said, we have another problem here. We have neo-imperialism. We have neo-colonialism. And I have an image here that speaks to that. Something very, very current that disturbs particularly Francophone Africans. What you can see here is, if you want, the illustrated manifestation of what Nkrumah meant back in the 60s by neocolonialism and imperialism. This is France, and these are the Francophone Africans. Just like the Anglophone Africans are part of the Commonwealth, they are part of the so-called Francophonie. I feel like saying something very critical, but it's not diplomatic. The currency of these countries used to be called le franc des colonies françaises d'Afrique. And they still have the same acronym, franc CFA, the franc CFA. And it was attached to the franc in France, fiscally. It was attached to the central bank's management in France. And it still is to this day attached to the euro via management from the French central bank. An important detail that today is causing an uproar in activist circles in Francophone countries. They want this capped. So this was the end, if you wish, of colonialism. And the economic, financial ties were still being decided in France. This is one example of what critics of neo-imperialism mean, that we are still not independent economically. Our currencies are not ours. This history of the franc CFA goes deep into the history of Europe, because the model, I just mentioned it, you can look it up. If you know the channel Arte, French-German cooperation channel, they have in their archives a very good documentary explaining how the franc CFA came about. But you see, you won't find it in a franc CFA documentary, you'll find it in a Nazi occupation of Western France documentary. Because that was the way the franc CFA is constructed, is the exact same way the Nazis created a currency system to control the occupied territories of Western France. And the French took over this model and applied it to their colonial territories, and it's still in place to this day. Untold story, but true story. And problematic story, and Pan-Africanists are waking up to this and refusing this. That's an economic dimension of it. You mentioned the political dimension of it. There is a political, economic, military, and cultural dimension to every one of these entities that I mentioned in the beginning. If the human being is a goal-pursuing, value-driven entity concerned with the fulfillment of their basic human needs, and now I'm going to share with you one of the most precious gems in Johan's toolbox. He found out in working that there is more than just coincidental isomorphism, also Gleichförmigkeit, similar structure, between the basic human needs at the individual level and the needs at the higher levels of organization of a state. So he mentioned the basic human needs to you today: freedom, identity, security, safety, and well-being. Right? This morning, I heard him mention that in Norwegian. This is at the individual level: freedom, identity, security, well-being. He mentioned, I think, that the negation of every basic human need is the shorthand in our work for violence. If you negate freedom, you are enacting violence on someone. If you negate identity, you're enacting violence on someone. If you negate safety and security, you're enacting violence on the individual. Well-being, the same. The negation of well-being is ill-being, illness. The negation of safety, security is destruction, military destruction, if you wish, physical destruction, physical insecurity. Of identity is cultural alienation, and freedom is political oppression, the negation of those. When you look at it not at the individual, this E is for individual, macro level. If you look at it at the macro level of states, we are talking about political freedom, so it becomes political freedom at the macro level, cultural identity discourses, military security discourses, and for well-being, it becomes economic questions. Economic questions. This is a demonstration or an illustration of the sentiment of Francophone Africans that their economic well-being is being determined by the French. You have, what you were talking about is that the political freedom, the controls, the checks and balances over decision makers is not in your hands, but it's in the political system that is alien to the political systems that are local. The lack of an organic system that came out of the culture. So it's an alienation, a cultural alienation, if you will, from the modes of translating pursuit of freedom into political systems. And this is a problem that we have all over the continent. And I mentioned one word before, maybe it went under, is the word mimesis. Mimesis. We like to, I said we have a continent with the continental Stockholm syndrome. Everything Europeans do, so far, we have been striving to imitate, to copy, to repeat, to reproduce. And it's been incomplete. And we've been reprimanded for this by the international organizations that watch over the proper implementation of these principles of governance. So we have to bring up good governance, and I don't want to get carried away. I have to be a bit specific. This problem that you see, and you asked for a solution, right? It's working.
Sorry, I think she said something about that one.
Yeah.
See, the academic and all the intellectuals couldn't fix the problem, but the singing together, which is African. That what reminds me of this. All the mechanism they use with the intellectuals and all these, but these two ladies hold hand and sang together, fix the problem, and that's not Western. That's African. So it's that, it seems like what I've been see confirming to me, what you've been thinking, that's it. This system of Western system, we can't just go for it completely. It has to be intermingled with our own.
I want to respond to that and saying, I believe that democracy isn't a Western monopoly. Contrary to the discourse, how we are made to believe, democracy is actually Gesundheit, an expression of a system with responsiveness built in. And I want to share with you knowledge of two systems that I wanted to share anyhow. One is a system that I read about that was destroyed by colonialism. I read about it when I was studying, and unfortunately I still have to look for the exact source and the exact people this is about. But I remember reading that British colonialism took over a specific space. I think it was somewhere in Kenya. I have to check again. And this is what happened. The core of the story is that they fought the resistance against their advance, and they decimated that particular community, that particular ethnic group's resistance. And the ethnologist writing about this wrote that in so doing, by decimating, reducing the population, unbeknown to them, they erased the historiography of those people. Because the way they wrote history was by giving names that contained the history of their people going back. So concretely, when you gave birth to a child, you gave a name to the child that expressed the ernte,
Elder.
no, from agriculture, how much harvest, thank you, that expressed the quality and quantity of harvest of that year, that expressed the relation to the neighboring village, the quality of that relation to the neighboring village, that expressed a wide range of things. How many daughters were born in that year? How many sons were born in that year? So when these people would have as a tradition to meet several times during the year in the central place of their village, and they would all have a roll call like in the UN. Everyone would say their name, from the youngest to the oldest. And by the time that was done, everybody remembered intergenerationally and had heard the story, the history of that population all the way back to the oldest living person, how the weather was, how the harvest was, whether they were at war. And so through the roll call and the name